following program on Other Derana 24 is classified for general audience. It is intended for all ages. It contains little or no violence, no strong language, and little or no sexual dialogue or situations.
Tonight, we discuss the legislation surrounding the regulation of industries in Sri Lanka. With the continuous increase in investment opportunities that are introduced to the country, what laws govern the growth and maintenance of these industries? How inclusive are these regulations in relation to their respective industries? And what does the future hold for the advancement of these legislation? A very good evening and thank you for joining us on yet another episode of Law, Land and Liberty, where we bring to you key events in the legal sphere and breaking it down for the layman. Now, tonight we have a topic that I'm sure a lot of us may not have directly thought about, but it does directly affect all of our lives, and that is the regulation of giant industries. Now, it's not just the giant pharmaceutical industries or consumer goods industries, but every little product we consume and every little interaction we have, these industries have something to do with it. So it's very important that we as a general public have an understanding of exactly how these industries are regulated. And to speak to us on that, we have a very notable figure in this field, and that is Attorney at Law and Solicitor Ranjan Seneviratne. Thank you very much, sir, for taking the time to speak to our viewers on this topic.
Good evening, Anuradhi, and thank you very much for having me today.
Of course.
And also thank you very much for selecting this timely topic and inviting me to discuss about it.
Thank you once again, sir. I'm sure we can look forward to a very insightful discussion. And before we get into this jam-packed discussion, let me give you a breakdown on exactly how this discussion is going to flow. So first we'll talk about the very basics, the fundamentals of regulating industries, and also some challenges that are currently present. Next, we'll go right into the legislature aspect of this entire scenario, and what legislatures are cumbersome and what amendments need to be made and what issues there are in the legislature. And finally, let's talk about the way forward for the future of regulating industries.
Hello, my name is Derana and I'm a media student. My question is about the regulation of industries. How industries regulated and what challenges do they face?
All right, without further ado, let's get right into the discussion. Sir, now I'm sure a lot of us have this question because we know that we are influenced by our industries around us, and we know that there's legislature that governs these industries, but we're really not sure about the very fundamental aspect of the regulation of industries. So could you please explain to us why such regulation is necessary?
Yeah, Anuradhi, I think globally almost all the governments are now moving away from commercial activities. And we all accept that traditional, conventional Marxist, Leninist socialism is dead. So even in Sri Lanka, we can say that even from the essential services, the government is moving away and they are encouraging the private sector to take up the businesses. So then the question is, what is the role of the government? So government has a huge role to play here. The role is to regulate these industries. I mean, there is a very extreme school of thought which says that industries must self-regulate and should not be regulated by the governments, but I think that's a minority view. Almost there is a consensus largely that the industries should be regulated. Then the question is to what extent the industries should be regulated and what are the checks and balances that we should have in place to prevent governments interfering with commercial activities. So what I see is, commercial activities should be regulated for many reasons. Mainly, most of these commercial industries, they are motivated by the profits. We know that, they talk about corporate social responsibility, CSR work, but still, in the end, the management is pressurized to give them a fat check on dividend. So that's the reason why government should intervene and especially protect the most vulnerable segments in the society. So government has the responsibility to mainly protect the environment and make sure that they comply with the climate change initiatives, and also to protect the vulnerable segments in the society like children and also wildlife, environment, etc.
Now, sir, a little bit of a follow-up question on to what exactly you mentioned, sir, where the government must step in, but it need not be the mandated regulator. So, sir, if you could just give us a little bit of insight on, if it's not the government, then who could be entitled to such regulation? Is it just a separate regulatory body, or
yes, that when we are talking about the government, anyway, government will have to act through various agencies. So it should be regulatory bodies, but it's the primary responsibility of the government first to have a policy framework, and under that policy framework, government should introduce regulations. What we see today is, I think the biggest problem is, I think the disconnect between the government's policy framework and the regulations made by various agencies.
So, sir, now we can, I think, get right into since you mentioned the biggest problem, we can get into the challenges aspect of this all. Now, when it comes to certain industries, there's a lot of struggle that has to happen in order for effective regulation to take place. So, sir, in your view, what are the biggest challenges that you see are faced by industries referring to this specific regulation area?
Yeah, I think when we are talking about regulations, there are two types of regulation. One is the general regulations applicable to all the industries, and then also we have specific regulations which applies only to the particular industry. I think when we are talking about the general regulation, there are a lot of challenges faced by the industries. The biggest challenge we have at the moment is most of our laws and regulations are outdated. That's the biggest problem, because most of the laws have been introduced about 30, 40 years ago, even 50 years ago. Some laws during the colonial period, and they have not been updated to meet the current global trends as well as policy changes in the subsequent governments. That's the biggest challenge. And in addition to that, various governments from time to time have introduced ad hoc regulations. And when they introduce one regulation to deal with a prevailing situation, but sometimes they introduce a regulation without cancelling the previous one. So these ad hoc regulations are also causing a lot of problems. And in addition to that, I think the problem is sometimes the lack of consultation, public consultation and industry consultation is a big issue, and suddenly government will introduce a law. I think the classic example we know fertilizer ban and then the asbestos ban, because those things are just introduced without any consultations and eventually resulted in a disaster.
Sir, a little bit of a follow-up question on that specific issue. In your opinion, how often does the government or regulatory bodies consider public sentiment like that?
Yeah, I think we don't have a very clear system where before a law is introduced, the public will be consulted. In most of the developed countries, they have their own systems. Before they introduce a law, they give about 3 months time, and they open it to the public to come and give their sentiments or their proposals. Especially if it's something which is applicable to a particular industry, they give an opportunity to that industry to come forward and give their proposal. So only after that they will introduce a law, but unfortunately we don't follow that practice in Sri Lanka.
So that practice is, it's present but it's obsolete, is it?
Yes, I think in most of the countries they do it as a practice, but it is a very good practice that we must have. I don't know whether you have seen now, we are talking about reforms of labor laws now. Recently, Ministry of Labour has called for public, feedback on the proposed changes to the labour laws.
Exactly. And sir, another question out of curiosity, sir. Now, are there certain industries that are impacted more than others when it comes to this regulatory disconnect?
Yes, there are, almost all the industries are impacted, but there are certain industries which are particularly impacted because of this disconnect. I think there are a lot of investors who are willing to invest in renewable energy. I think they have a huge issue because of this, mainly because of the lack of coordination between different regulatory industries and also ad hoc regulations. And also I think the education is another area. There are a lot of investors who are willing to invest in the higher education sector, but the problem is they are not very clear about the regulatory framework.
But sir, another question that comes into mind is thinking retrospectively. Now we know that in the current situation there is a challenge for industries when it comes to regulatory bodies and regulations in general. But when we think of it in retrospect, has there been any improvement over the years, or has the situation only gotten worse?
Well, I can't say that. I mean, there have been improvements in certain areas, especially in relation to efficiency. I know that especially in relation to investment, facilitation, BOI and the finance ministry has taken certain steps. So we can call them improvements, but I think there is a lot to be done.
There is a lot, of course, and I think a lot of us might have this question as well. Now, we talked about the big industries. We always have that issue about these small startups, you know, people from our country, nationalistic individuals that want to contribute to whatever development method that the country is going in. We have the issue where startups are not given as much of support as it should be. So, could you just briefly explain to us what challenges are specifically faced by young startups?
Yeah, I think we have been talking about it under one of our organizations, Aramuna. We have met a lot of young entrepreneurs and with some bright, brilliant business ideas. I think the problem is even the government at policy level, I think they are focused on attracting foreign investments, which is a good thing and we have to do it. But also, I think we have to do more, I think, to encourage local young generation to, I think, become entrepreneurs. I think that's not part of our culture. Maybe that's a reason. And even if you go, I think the biggest challenge they face, I think, is financing, because our banking and finance sector is overregulated. And also, I think there are labor law issues. I think we can discuss it later when we are talking about labor law.
Of course, not before the enforcement aspect, we can talk about the legislative aspects as well. But before we go into the legislative aspects, I think it's important for us to understand that specifically in areas where different legislatures have to interconnect in order to grant such regulations and in order to govern certain industries. So do you believe that there is a disconnect between the legislature and that is causing issues with regulation?
Yeah, I think there is a disconnect between the legislature and the industries and the public. That's the biggest problem we have. I think the reason is we don't have consultations, public consultations. The classic example I gave you, fertilizer ban. I mean, government just thought that, I mean, the intention was very good. I mean, banning chemical fertilizer, but the problem is they never consulted the industry, or they didn't listen to the industry. I think because of that lack of consultation between the public and then the industries and the government, I think there is a disconnect. That's the biggest problem we have at the moment.
Well, when it comes to the legislative setbacks as well, there's a lot for us to talk about. There's a lot to unpack, especially in the investment area as well. But before we get into any of that, let's go in for a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. Stay with us.
Student. My question is about the legislation. What are the key issues that must be addressed in the law relating to regulations?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We were in discussion with attorney at law and solicitor Ranjan Seneviratne, and we were talking about the regulation of industries. Now, right before we went into a break, so we were talking about the challenges that were faced by large industries and small-scale industries alike, and also startups. Now, we mentioned multiple times about how the legislature also has caused some hindrances towards the effective regulation of these industries. So, I think we should get into the most relevant area of this discussion, I feel, when it comes to setbacks. So, sir, among legislative setbacks, what do you believe is the biggest piece of legislature that is causing such a disconnect for this regulation aspect?
Yeah, there are several, Anuradhi, but I would identify labor law, the laws relating to employment, poses the biggest challenge to industries, investors as well as startups. So the biggest problem is most of these laws were introduced during colonial period or before the open economy was introduced into this country. So the laws are mainly based on some socialist ideas. And also there are a lot of changes have happened, especially after post-COVID, which, these requirements are not reflected in the current legal regime. I'll give you a couple of examples. One area is, now there have been a lot of research into this area, especially the young generation, these millennials and generation, is said, apparently they are more concerned about flexible working hours and also flexibility about the location. But unfortunately, our laws do not recognize that. So that's something we have to update our laws. And also another area is, I think, termination of employment. This is a big issue. I have seen many instances where investors who are willing to invest in Sri Lanka, they usually, before they invest, they go to a law firm, and one of the basic questions they ask is about recruitment. If I recruit someone, if it's a wrong recruitment, can I get rid of that employee? Can I if I find a better employee, can I get him? I think this is something we have to change.
Definitely, there is a lot of hindrances when it comes to the legislative aspect. Now, sir, just to specify on the labor law issues, we saw recent amendments. Has there not been any sort of addressing of these issues when it comes to the Labor Law Act?
Yes, there have been changes, minor amendments, but the problem is what we need is a complete overhauling of the labor laws. I think already the Ministry of Labour has started that process, but this process, I think, was started about 10 years ago. Also, nothing happened, I think, due to the pressure from various interested segments.
So it's yet to come into fruition.
Yes.
So then, sir, I think very important to for us to understand exactly how this is affecting on a personal level, sir. If you could give us some industry-specific examples of where these regulation disconnects have caused obstructions, like in specific industries that are relevant to everyday people. So if you could just break down maybe the pharmaceutical industry, how there is an issue because of regulation itself.
I think pharmaceutical industry is an industry which is highly regulated, but for the right reasons. But at the moment, pharmaceutical industry's biggest challenge is, I think, the time taken to approve new drugs. And also, I think local regulatory bodies do not recognize the certification issued by international regulatory bodies. So, and also we don't have any enough laboratory facilities to issue certificates. So because of that, I think pharmaceutical industry is facing a lot of issues. But I also understand that at the moment there is some sort of engagement going on between the health ministry and the pharmaceutical industry to sort out these issues. And yes, I mean, there is another area, I think, renewable energy investors are facing a lot of issues, regulatory issues. I think that is mainly because there are multiple agencies that they have their own independent regulations, and there is a disconnect between those industries, and also the regulations have not been updated. Especially the government has formulated a policy framework for climate change initiatives. But unfortunately, still government has not created a policy framework for renewable energy.
I see. So those are some legislative issues. Now I think, sir, we should get into the second area of this discussion, where the investment aspect. Of course, for industries to thrive, there needs to be investment, and for our economic growth, there has to be some form of investment potential. Now, sir, if you could please specify further. Now, I understand you mentioned in passing how there is an obstruction to investment. If you could get in depth about how investment in itself is obstructed due to these regulation defects, if I say.
Yes, I think when we are talking about, investment, we are mainly talking about foreign investment and large-scale investment projects. I think the biggest problem is, again, disconnect between various agencies and then multiple sets of regulations, which have, the different agencies are in charge of these regulations. And if you are an investor, you have to go from one agency to another to get the approvals. We have BOI. BOI is the main investment facilitator. And recently BOI launched this the center called IFC Investor Facilitation Center, which is a very good, brilliant idea. But the problem is, now let's say that I have an investment proposal, I go to the BOI, and then BOI should be able to negotiate or collaborate with all the other agencies and get all the approvals to make sure that the project is implemented. But the problem is BOI is trying to do that, but there is no the BOI law does not allow them to enforce. They can't demand other agencies to do anything. If they don't comply with what they request, then there is nothing much they can do. So because of that, if you are a foreign investor, let's say if it's a specific project which requires special approval, like if it's a pharmaceutical product, you have to get the approval from the NMRA, or if it's a renewable energy product, then you have to go to the Renewable Energy Authority. Then you have to do it yourself. And not only that, there are a lot of other things. For example, if you want to get a land, you have to go to at least 3-4 places, and you have to go to the land ministry to get the environmental clearance. You have to go to a central environmental authority, and then if the land is subject to forest ordinance or something, then you have to go to the forest department. And those institutions don't work in coordination. That's the biggest problem we have at the moment.
So there's an integration issue at the very heart of it. But now, just picking on a specific point that you mentioned, sir, about the BOI. Now, you mentioned that while the BOI is responsible for drafting proposals and such, and a little bit of a hub for investment, it has no regulatory authoritative power in order to convince or in order to make something of an investment happen. Is that what you're saying, sir?
Yeah, that's actually the problem. Although BOI has launched this Investor Facilitation Center, so if I submit a proposal to the BOI, they call from all the authorities to send a representative. For example, someone from the Forest Department, someone from the Renewable Energy Authority if it's a renewable energy project, or if it's a pharmaceutical project from NMRA. So they get all these people to come. But the problem is they don't have any authority to, for example, give them a deadline. Look, this is a strategic development project. This is very important to the country, and this project will bring foreign investment. So you have to fast track. So they can't give a deadline and tell another government authority to give the approval. That's the biggest problem we have.
There is no expediting of processes when
Yes.
it's absolutely essential for us. So I think it's very timely for us to mention. Now, sir, you mentioned that there are amendments. They are not exactly completely effective, but there have been some amendments. So do you believe that we need, are there specific amendments that we can make to the existing legislature in order to better facilitate investments, or do you believe a system overhaul is due?
I think when it comes to investment, we have a basic structure. So that is the BOI. So I don't think you have to, do an overhauling there. But yes, there should be some amendments to make the process effective, and also to give some teeth to the BOI.
But when it comes to the comparison between international investments, foreign investments, and what happens locally, is there a difference in the level of difficulty of investing and when regarding basically regulations? Is there a significant difference for foreign investment and local, or is it easier on one end?
I won't say it's easier, but I think challenges are the same. But if you look at a foreign investor, because they don't know about the country and sometimes they don't tolerate the delay, and they usually work on specific timelines. The problem is local investors, they know about Sri Lanka, and anyway they have to invest in Sri Lanka. So they won't get frustrated easily, and also they know how to get, go where to go, and they have the resources. But the problem with foreign investors is they usually come to Sri Lanka with very specific timelines. And when there are delays happening at various points, then they get frustrated and then they leave. That's the biggest problem we have. And in the past, we have seen a lot of proposals. The investors who have brought very good proposals, they have left the country.
Of course, if there is no sort of accommodation for them when it comes to the investment process, there's going to be reluctance. It's going to be met with reluctance, of course. Now, I think is a good time to ask these follow-up questions when it comes specifically to the courts aspect. Now, how big of a role do the courts, the Sri Lankan courts, play when it comes to the regulation of these regulations, where now we have large legislatures like the labour law and also investment law. Now, when it comes to practical application within the courts, how significant of a role do you believe the courts play, sir, when it comes to this?
Well, I think court has a big role to play, but I think the most important thing is from the government's point of view, from the regulators' point of view, we must have a very clear regulations, and you have to make sure that the investors will not have to go to courts. I'm not talking about other things like contractual issues or other issues where you have to go to courts, but when it comes to regulation, I think compliance should be made very easy with specific regulations. At the moment, the problem is some government agencies, they are also not clear about the regulations they have. That's because we have been making ad hoc regulations. So court will have to give the confidence to the investors, because I have seen most of the investors who come to Sri Lanka, they always ask this question about courts, whether for commercial disputes do we have to go to the same court, or whether you have different court systems like that. So in that sense, I understand that court has a role to play to give the confidence to the investors. But when it comes to regulations, I think clarity of the regulation is the most important thing.
Of course, and there is a huge issue when it comes to the integration aspect as well, where there are multiple agencies that are responsible for certain issues of the same problem, and there is no communication between them. Now, sir, do you believe that we can expect to see integration in the future, according to what you have seen with your experience?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of proposals. Only thing is, nothing has been implemented yet, but you would have seen even in media that the reforms in relation to power and energy sector, that new electricity bill where the government is trying to integrate, or actually what they're trying to do is disintegrate, but to make it more efficient. So there always, I don't know, if you look at in the past 10 years, there have been many proposals like that, but unfortunately, all the governments have failed to implement them. You can't blame the politicians alone. I think a lot of pressure is coming from the unions and various other segments in the society. But I think the current post-COVID and due to the current economic situation, I think there is a lot of appetite for changes, and especially integration of the regulatory bodies.
Of course, we can talk a lot about the changes in our final segment, sir, but before we get into that, I think it's very important for us to discuss a little bit about the people aspect of regulation. Now, the regulation of people we saw under labour law, and there are issues, there are lapses in legislature, especially when considering trade unions. What are the biggest issues you see, sir, when it comes to the hindrance of regulation through agencies such as trade unions and trade union law? If you could just elaborate.
Yeah, again, I think, as I said, I think we need an overhauling of all our labour laws and laws relating to employment, including the laws relating to trade unions. And collective bargaining has been there for a long time, and even in developed countries it is still there. But I think the biggest problem we have in relation to trade union is, I think, politicization of trade union activities, because we have seen many times, I can understand if you form a trade union and you collectively bargain with your employer, which is not a bad thing. But most of the trade unions, we have also seen that they have been politicized, and these trade unions are driven for political purposes. I think there has to be some changes in the law to address this issue. But I understand where a lot of, I think, people or lawyers representing industries have already made their submissions to the Labour Ministry.
Of course, there's a lot of changes that have to be made. But sir, before we, once again, one final question, sir. Now the private regulation, self-regulation and regulation via governmental authorities or other third parties, how vast of a difference is there when it comes to regulation, self-regulation of certain industries and regulation by another overseer?
I think this is as I told you earlier, there is this extreme view that government should not regulate industries and industries should have their own regulatory framework. I know that especially in Europe, most of the companies, multinational companies, especially the companies involved in consumer goods, they have done it. For example, I think tobacco industry first adopted, I think, the advertising ban even before the laws were introduced to ban advertising like that. But again, I really don't think that self-regulation is an effective way to protect especially the vulnerable segments, because as I told you earlier, eventually I can understand that the big company at the corporate level, at their board level, they may make policy decisions that we'll be responsible corporate citizens and we will not do this, we will respect all these things. But the problem is at the lower level, the managements, especially the junior management who are selling the actual products, they are under pressure to perform, and there can be violations. So it's very important that you have a regulatory framework to prevent those things happening.
Of course, to be held accountable by another party is to ensure that there is some semblance of regulation, at least in gigantic industries as well as small scale industries. Well, I think that was a very comprehensive second segment when coming into discussion about investment and also the legislative aspects. So I think what is left for us to discuss is on the enforcement, the practicality aspects, and also what the future holds for regulation of industries, and also a little bit on investments as well. But before we get into that discussion, let's take a very short commercial break. You're watching Law, Land and Liberty. Stay with us.
And I'm a law student of Sri Lanka Law College. My question is about enforcement. How does an enforcement of legislative governing regulations affect industries?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We were in discussion with attorney at law and solicitor Ranjan. and we were talking about the regulation of industries, and we had quite the insightful discussion on basically the fundamentals of industries and their regulation, and we were talking about the critical aspects of where there's lapses in legislature as well. But we didn't specifically get into the enforcement aspect of it, which I think is pretty vital, and also of course the future, what it looks like for us, the way forward. So sir, if you could just explain to us how drastically does the enforcement of legislature that's already in place affect industries in the present, sir?
Yeah, I think when we are talking about regulations, there are two angles. One is compliance by the industries, and then enforcement against non-compliance. There are a lot of challenges faced, by the industries. I'm just talking from the point of view of the industries, especially with regard to consumer goods industries. For example, I'll take you this example about the Food Act, but I think this applies to various other areas of laws as well. So one thing is the way, most of the agencies who are in charge of enforcement, especially their officials, they think that their role is to not to monitor the ensure compliance, but punish the industries when they are in breach of the regulation. The reason is, I think that's how they have designed their incentive schemes as well. For example, if you are a PHI, then what they do is they give you a target. You have to have minimum number of court cases, you have to recover this much, the amount of this much from fines. So even the police have the same targets. So what they do is that because their promotions will depend on their performance on these aspects. So because of that, we have seen many instances, especially in relation to the consumer goods, rather than doing that monitoring part to ensure compliance, they will try to catch people who act in violation of the existing regulations. I think that we should correct.
Of course, the fundamental nature of a regulation is not for punishment, but rather for prevention of any violations. And sir, now we did not touch on this in the previous segment, but it is quite important when it comes to the practical aspect of the legislature and the enforcement of this legislature, which is the bribery and corruption aspect. Now, corruption in its sense, sir, could you please explain to us how effectively does these laws deal with regulation violations in regarding corruption, sir? Is there does it cover all the bases, or is there lapses once again?
Yes, we have the basic framework. So we have the Bribery Act, which covers most of the basic things. But I think the problem is when it comes to compliance and to, the steps that you have to take to ensure compliance and also enforcement. I think, I'm talking in relation to corporates and businesses. But if you look at the UK Bribery Act or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of USA, there are a lot of the things that we have to, or steps that we have to introduce into the law of Sri Lanka. Especially, we had to prevent bribery and corruption happening at corporate levels. For example, under the UK Bribery Act, there are a lot of compliance requirements for industries. So you have to have your own anti-corruption and bribery policy. You must have your internal guidelines, and even you have to educate your employees, and you have to get a sign off from your employees that annually you have to get a sign off from your employees that you are fully compliant with the Bribery and Corruption Acts. So these things will ensure that the companies will not engage in corrupt practices. For example, now let's say that a company, I know that company at the board level, they will not decide that we'll go and bribe this person and get this done. But they obviously they encourage, because they know that there are no consequences. For example, if the company has an anti-bribery and corruption policy at the top level, and they know that they are bound by that. For example, if a junior level employee acts in breach of the bribery and corruption law, then eventually the top level, the people at the top level management will also be responsible. I think those procedures must be introduced into the Sri Lankan system. I know that even if you look at the political debate at the moment happening against corruption and bribery, they talk about, we will catch those who are engaged in corruption and bribery, but they never talk about the change of the system. What we need is a system which will prevent people engaging in corrupt and bribery and corrupt practices.
Of course, there is a lot, especially when it comes to the bribery and corruption aspect. I'm sure a lot of us had that question as well, because when we think of giant corporations and big industries, we always feel that what is happening in the country when it comes to certain instances, maybe personal instances as well, where there are lapses and there is no regulatory body in order to notify and prevent such injustices from happening. So like you mentioned, sir, there are international examples that we can draw from. But sir, I think we need to talk a little bit about other changes that we can make in our country, the legislative aspect that we can make, where we can ensure better regulations. So if you could guide us through some suggestions that you might have, sir.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, I think this consultative process is very important before you introduce regulations. Because the problem is we introduce regulations without any consultations from the industry or the public, and eventually those regulations will have unintended consequences, and also they will not achieve the objective of the regulation. We can give you many examples, even the regulations introduced in the recent past. What we do is, we don't go to the public, we don't give anyone any opportunity, and you just place it before the parliament, and people will only have that small window of 7 days to go to courts and challenge the law based on constitutionality. So even in the court, the debate will be limited to the constitutionality, and there is no discussion, especially with the industries and the public, about the practicability of the law or the regulation. I think this is a must. This is why most of the laws introduced by the governments in the recent past have these unintended consequences.
Of course. Now I think it's important that you mentioned, so there are these unintended consequences, and there are specific areas of specific industries that might be affected under this enforcement aspect. Like you mentioned earlier, sir, the renewable energy industries that are taking a huge blow right now, because there is a little bit of an issue with the regulatory bodies on how to proceed as well. So if you could draw attention to exactly where these lapses lie when it comes to very key areas such as renewable energy, and of course there's the climate change issue as well. These regulations are not being spoken about in the public forum as much, but it is being mentioned by our viewers. So if you could please just break down how there could be changes made for that specific area, sir.
Yeah, I think renewable energy is a specific area because we recently started calling for proposals to introduce large-scale renewable energy projects. But again, the problem is, I think we call for proposals under the existing legal framework, and some of these laws were, I think, introduced about 30-40 years ago. And I think the problem is the disconnect between the recent laws and also the past laws and also the different agencies. So what we need to do is, I think, again, you should go for a consultation the process with the public and also the interested parties, and you should ensure that all these projects are implemented smoothly, because I understand that even the president is very keen on, I think, introducing some climate change initiatives, and he has his own secretariat, which is very good. So I think now it's the time to have consultations from the industries, not only renewable energy, various other industries, especially about the controlling emissions and usage of plastics, and also, I think, environmental impact, etc. And another area I think we need some sort of overhauling is, I think, the laws relating to land, because we know that most of the commercially valuable lands are currently occupied by the governments. And some of even the government entities which are supposed to do business, they don't have any business plans. And those properties are just lying idle. And I think government should introduce some way to release those properties for investment purposes. And also I think the approvals for various investment projects, especially the approvals by the Central Environmental Authority issuing the environmental clearances. That's where most of the projects are stuck. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to ignore the environmental impact, but I have seen many instances where the environmental license have been refused just because they don't understand, or they say that we don't have any facility to check whether this will have an impact or not. Just because of that, they refuse to issue the certificate, the environmental clearance. So those things should be addressed generally to facilitate investment. And another area is, I think, banking and finance. We have a highly overregulated banking and finance industry. I think we have to look at the global trends and simplify.
Of course, I mean, in one area there's too stringent and too specific of regulation, in other areas it's too lax and it's too ad hoc. So there's a lot of balancing that needs to happen legislatively speaking. Now, sir, before I get into the final question, just a little bit of a follow-up question. There's the practicality aspect of enforcement. How drastically do you believe, sir, that it affects the efficiency of certain industries?
No, I think enforcement is a must. I mean, whatever you do, whatever the compliance guidelines you issue to industries, still there will be non-compliance instances. So in situations like that, you have to enforce the regulation. I don't think any industry or anyone can complain about it. But the problem is, again, whatever the enforcement should be, should not be unlawful, because we have seen, I can give you many examples, I mean, where the authorities, they just try to enforce laws which do not exist. And also they just harass the industries to take them to courts and impose a fine. But I have seen many instances where certain, for example, some multinational companies, they have been prosecuted for violating very minor things like labeling the issue. And then what they do is they summon the entire board of directors to court. Of course, there is a direction issued by the AG to the enforcement officers that not to do that, but still you need some regulatory changes. The problem is, for example, there are situations where you have to enforce the law. That's not happening. But sometimes these enforcement agencies, when they see that there is a possibility for reputational issues or other issues, they'll come to courts and pay a fine and then settle it. They go after those industries.
Of course, and that is a very specific area that I wish we had time to delve deep on. But before we end this discussion, sir, a final question for you. When it comes to international parallels, do you believe, looking at the trends from other countries that are around us in the geographical sense, where there are certain climates that is a little bit similar for us when it comes to economically, do you believe that the future of industrial regulation is looking to be rather grim, or is it hopeful?
No, I think, I'm not saying that it is grim, but I understand we have very unique local situations that we face at the moment. But at the same time, we can draw, I think, a lot of, parallels with the international trends, especially when it relates to Bribery Act and then renewable energy and other climate change initiatives, power and energy sector, health, pharmaceutical, and especially the education. That all these things, I'm sure that there are a lot of parallels that we can draw with international trends, and I'm sure that we should learn from the experiences of others. I'm sure that we should look at the legislation, similar legislations passed in developed countries, and then we should adopt them if they are suitable to our country.
Definitely. Well, I feel like that is the perfect note for us to end this discussion on, sir. While there is quite a little bit more for us to dig into specifics, unfortunately time has come against us. So it was quite the insightful discussion, sir. Thank you very much for taking the time to explain to our viewers exactly how these regulations take place and what needs to change and how it's happening currently. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, it is safe to say that the future of Sri Lanka's economic landscape depends upon the growth of industrial opportunity. However, it's important that these industries do not go unchecked and operate upon the best interests of the general public. We leave you tonight with the words of renowned legal scholar Dr. Upendra Baxi. The regulation of industries should strike a delicate balance between facilitating economic growth and protecting public interests. It is essential to develop robust regulatory mechanisms that ensure fair competition, safeguard consumer rights, and promote sustainable development. That is all we have for you tonight on Law, Land and Liberty. If you missed today's program, you can always rewatch the entire episode on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Derana English. I'm Anuradhi Vikramasinghe. Thank you for watching. Have a great night.